Catherine, Richard, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Guido. How are you doing?
We're fine, thank you. Yourselves and the family?
Yeah, we're doing okay.
Great, yeah. Thank you for being prepared to do this interview. I'm sure many people will be interested in your own life as Christian workers in Japan, but then also to hear more about the general status of Christianity and the church in Japan. So if that's all right for you, I'll ask a few questions and then we just see how it goes. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, so let me introduce Richard and Catherine East. They've been in Japan for how many years?
Me about 12 years and Catherine about 10 years.
Right. And during that time, what did you get up to?
Do you want to go first? Richard went there first as a missionary before we were married.
So I had a year doing short-term work, teaching in a church plant where I was doing English teaching, teaching about a dozen English classes a week to try and welcome people into the church and share the gospel with them. Then later on, I did Japanese language training and then student evangelism. And then together, we did church planting in northern Japan.
So quite a varied breadth of ministry, and I'm sure you got to know Japanese people and the Japanese culture quite well.
And after we did the church planting, we then moved to Tokyo, and Richard was involved with student work at the universities there, and I was involved in local ministry, local evangelism.
Right. So where were you before you went to Tokyo?
We were up in Hokkaido.
Is that the island to the north of the main island, Honshu? Right.
Yes.
Where it can get quite cold.
Very cold.
Yeah, we have a lot of snow in the winter. You wouldn't see the sidewalk for months on end.
And good for skiing?
Yeah, I
did
a bit of snowboarding. And then we had our daughters were quite young when we were there. And so tobogganing in the park and things like that as well.
And so snowy, sorry, Guido, to interrupt, if you've got young children, instead of pushing them in a pushchair, you pull them on a toboggan. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds like fun as well.
Yeah, it was.
But let me rewind the tape a bit. Why Japan? Why did you end up in Japan?
Well, for me, I actually studied Japanese at university, and that was before I was a Christian. So I was learning about Japan, and as I was considering the claims of Christ, there was actually in the church where I was finding out more about Jesus, that the church supported a missionary in Japan. And so the very same room where I was reading the Bible, there was a prayer card of this lady. And so from the very start, as I considered the gospel, I was considering whether what I was learning about Japan, I could use that to serve the Lord. And also understanding that if the gospel was true for me as an English girl, then it was also true for the Japanese people. And how could I be involved in bringing the message to them as well? How about for you, love?
Yeah, so Catherine's love of Japan came first and then her love for Jesus. And for me, it was the other way around. I really got to know more about the Bible when I went to university and began getting excited about sharing with other people, even thinking about being a pastor when I graduated. But I really didn't like the idea of going to another country like a missionary. I thought that would be a bit extreme. But friends and church and people around me helped me to see that every Christian really should think about the part they play in God's global mission plan. And so I began to think about that possibility as well. And then that led to me doing a year short term in Japan. I didn't actually apply to Japan. I just applied to a mission to do a short-term service somewhere, and they placed me in Japan. And then going there, I just fell in love with the country and saw the needs and really wanted to go back long-term.
That's interesting to hear. But I can imagine that it wasn't easy sailing all the time. You say the love for the country. Yes, I'm sure that came. But did you face any particularly difficult periods or difficult situations?
Yeah, lots of different times and difficulties and struggles that I think God really used to grow me. One of the hardest times was learning Japanese. Unlike Catherine, I didn't have much Japanese before I went, but I realized that in order to be teaching the Bible, to be more useful long term, that I should try and get really good Japanese. And studying full time for about a year and a half when I was single was sometimes quite draining, quite lonely, quite hard, and at the same time, I often felt quite useless. I'm not actually achieving anything, but a very important part of being useful long term.
Yeah. What about Catherine?
Well, I think tough times were particularly when we had very young children and we were involved in church planting, and Sundays in particular were a challenge. So we were a very small church, and every week we had to set up, we didn't have our own church building, so we had to set up a room in a leisure centre. And Richard was really busy on Sundays. He would be preaching, maybe running a meeting beforehand, leading the worship on his guitar. Our little girls obviously wanted to be near him, and but he couldn't really, he didn't have the time for them at church, as it were. So yeah, Sundays were hard, and I think also spiritually just really dark days for me in the house, just waiting for church in the afternoon, because we did it in the afternoon, didn't we? Yeah.
Well, that's very honest of you. Thank you, Catherine. But hopefully there were also joyful experiences, times when you saw God at work and when you felt, yeah, that's it, that's right, we are in the right place.
Well, I remember just thinking of the Sundays and the kind of battle we felt getting out there and welcoming people and preaching. Every week when we were on our way home, we felt completely drained, but thankful. You know, someone had shown interest, someone had understood something, someone had invited a friend, someone's eyes really seemed to being opened. And so, yeah, all the time, just seeing small examples of the Holy Spirit gradually at work, bringing people to himself, growing his people.
And I think another thing that I remember is how God often met us very pertinently in our Bible reading. So we would, yeah, do you remember?
Just in our regular personal Bible reading, sometimes the passage for that day was just exactly what we needed.
Yeah.
A challenge or an encouragement or, just keeping us going.
Beautiful. So he was with you in all the times, difficult or easy. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And we look back to see those years as years that we just learned so much about God, about marriage, about family life, about ministry in Japan.
So no regrets?
No.
Great. You now find yourselves in the UK. Are you going back?
Not in the short or medium term.
Yeah, we needed to come back for family reasons, and so when we were thinking about what we do when we came back to London, knowing the needs of the gospel amongst Japanese people, and we really thought hard about whether we could continue to serve in mission amongst Japanese people back in London. And our mission has a group of people who work trying to share the gospel with East Asians outside of East Asia, called Diaspora Returnee Ministry. And so we've transferred across from the Japan section to that section. And our hope is to be working with Japanese people who are in London up to 3 years, making disciples, helping them to be ready to return to serve Jesus back in Japan.
Oh, that sounds exciting, and it sounds like a good continuation of what you've been doing before in Japan. It's almost like a logical step forward, since you can't go back to Japan in the immediate future. Yeah. Well, let me come back to that a little bit later, but can I ask about your experience of the Japanese church? What are we talking about? Is it huge churches like in some parts of the world, or is it small churches? Is it tough going? Tell us a bit more about your experience of the church and of Christianity in Japan.
Yeah, so in Japan, Christianity is very much a minority religion. Probably about 1% of the population would say that they're Christian, but a much smaller proportion, maybe 1 in 200 people, would be actively involved in a church. So, and many churches are pretty small. The average is about 28 members. And another thing about the churches, the population of Japan as a whole is very aging. So over 50,000 people over 100 years old. And that's reflected in the church as well. The average age of pastors is 68 years old. So there's a real need for younger leaders, younger Christians to step up and pass on to the next generation.
But you also worked with students. Did you find young people receptive? Did they engage with the gospel?
Yes, I think that there's actually way more interest and openness to engage with the Bible and the gospel than many Japanese Christians realize. And one of the reasons that we wanted to work with students is because we just see this huge need for the gospel being passed to the next generation and raising up Japanese Christian leaders. But I think that among students in Japan, where they have a bit more time, a bit more flexibility, a bit more open to new ideas, it's just a wonderful opportunity to be together with Japanese Christians sharing the gospel amongst the millions of students in Japan.
You mentioned very small churches and very small proportion of the population being Christian. That goes counter what's experienced in many other East Asian countries, where the church has phenomenally grown over the last 20, 30 years. Yeah. Can you put a finger onto it? Why should that be the case?
So I think many people, sociologists and mission theologians, have asked that question and tried to find different ideas. And so there's been many theories put forward. Certainly in Japan, there's been a very unique history of not wanting to be overly influenced by things from outside. There's also, in Japan, it's very difficult to stick out and be different. There's the saying, deru kugi wa utareru, which means the nail that sticks up will be hammered down. In that kind of context, it can be very difficult to stick out and be different and witness. But there have been times in Japanese history, times when the church has really grown. For example, after the war, when lots of missionaries came in and there was a real openness and quite some church growth. But then numbers of baptisms, new churches planted went down and down. So I think there are different reasons that you could come up with. But I also think that the the time for Japan to have huge growth in the church will come again. So many people have been praying, so many missionaries have come. There's so much availability of the gospel, there's freedom for the gospel to be spread. I and many of my colleagues are sure that at some point there will be a much greater turning to the Lord in Japan.
And looking at what you're going to do now, or what you're already doing, ministering to Japanese people here in the UK or in London, in your case, can you see that as part of God's plan?
Definitely. We know from Acts that God is in charge of where everybody lives, and so that I forget the exact quote, but we're confident that God is in charge of the movement of peoples around the world. And
that includes us.
Yeah, that includes us. That includes the Japanese students, the people on working holiday visas that we're hoping to get to know here in the UK from Japan, that they might reach out and find him.
Yes, so we're sure that God has a plan in these things.
Do you expect the same resistance, difficulty that you found in Japan among Japanese people abroad?
It's funny you should ask that. Richard was telling me a while back that one pastor in Japan said it's like Japanese people have an allergy to Christianity when they're in Japan, but when they go overseas, somehow the allergy, it often clears up. And so there is a greater receptiveness to the Christian message. And I understand that proportionally, more Japanese people become Christians outside Japan than inside Japan. I think the challenge then is helping them to be prepared to go back to Japan and thrive as Christians and want to share the message. So we're excited about our work because not only will we be holding out the message of Jesus to Japanese who come here, but also be thinking how to help them prepare to go back and live for Jesus in Japan.
And we ourselves have seen, while we were working in Japan, a number of Japanese friends who've become Christians overseas, and then been a huge blessing to a church or a ministry when they've come back to Japan and got established in a church. But sadly, many come back to Japan and don't take that step.
Okay, yeah. Looking at Christians, British Christians or Western Christians here in the UK, in the Western countries, obviously not everybody will want to learn Japanese, not everybody will be able to go to Japan for various reasons. But can you see a role for Christians in this country, in London in particular, or the rest of the country, in reaching out to Japanese people here?
Yes, I think there's the main things are befriending, welcoming, being open, being ready to share with not just Japanese, but people from all nations who are all over the UK. And I think the opportunity is huge. People from Japan are going to be much more open probably to the gospel than they would be in their home country. Other people would be from countries where if you went to their country, you wouldn't be allowed freely to share the gospel. So I think the opportunities are huge. And not only to share the gospel, but then to encourage and disciple and to help them to go back. So welcoming people into churches, befriending them, and then also praying. We felt so much when we were working in Japan that the work was really only going forward because of the people who were praying for us, mainly back in the UK. And so we're always excited when we hear about prayer groups or individuals faithfully praying for churches and missionary work in Japan.
So where would one start if one wanted to get involved with ministry to Japanese people?
Well, a great place to go would be mission websites, and so the OMF website, but there's also other missions. One site I think is a must for anyone wanting to get more involved in God's global mission plan is the Joshua Project, just to really get informed about the different situation of churches in different countries. And not only that, but they've got details about people from countries where there's not much gospel witness going on in other countries, like some of the East Asians in European countries. So there's a lot of things on the web that you can go to, and increasing numbers of churches have opportunities to gather together people who are interested in mission. And certainly if you're thinking about getting more involved in God's global mission plan, talk to people at your church, especially leadership and pastors. I think that's a great step to take early on.
And to go back to ministry to Japanese people here, would it require special skills or training or anything like that?
So I think the number one thing is just being friendly and being willing to give time. I had one Japanese friend who came to stay in our apartment for a few weeks. He moved to London and stayed with us when he first arrived. And he just was so happy to meet and talk to English people. And he was very happy to come along to church. I'd invited him to church loads of times when we were in Japan, and he never came. And there are international cafes, specific events that churches and organizations like Friends International put on for visitors to the country. Those are something that you can get involved in. There is training that is available, and OMF has some training that's available. There are books, there are podcasts, there are lots of things you can do to be more aware of people's culture, where they're coming from. But I think the main thing is love and willingness to be used to bless that person.
And praying for them.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And just to conclude, how can we pray for you if people feel they want to take you up in their regular prayers? How can they go about it? What are your requests at the moment?
Thank you. Well, obviously, it's a strange time in terms of the pandemic. We're really praying that there will be young Japanese people coming to London who will be won for Christ, built up in him, and sent back to be long-term disciple makers back in Japan. And so I think for us to have really good connections with churches in London, some of the Japanese fellowships, and groups doing similar work like UCCF and Friends International, to be really good at working well with other groups.
Thank you. That was very insightful, and I'm sure many people will appreciate your sharing both about yourselves and about the people and the country of Japan. So thank you again for doing this interview. Yeah. Many, many blessings.